now. All right, hello everyone. So this is our lecture on evolution and the origin of biodiversity. So this is all about how the different species in biology are come forth. So evolution is one of those things where it's an origin of life thing. So it's right up there with creationism and other theories. But in science and biology, the theory that holds the most holds the most water, the one that holds the most evidence, is the theory of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin. So we're going to talk about that in this session. So, what is evolution? Evolution is basically the change in traits of a population over time. When we say traits, we're talking about uh, characteristics that are determined by genes, and when we say population, we mean a group of one species. Okay, so that means that over time, a population changes. There's always change that happens. For example, cats over time, what we know as cat will change. Of course, it means over a very, very long period of time, over many, many generations. That's what evolution is. It's not Pokemon where it suddenly turns into something completely different. Okay, it's a gradual change of their traits. Now, evolution tends to result in biodiversity. It results in many different forms of life. That's why we have many different species. Now, how did people explain biodiversity before evolution? How do we have so many forms of life if we didn't have a concept of evolution before? What other theories were there? First, as mentioned before, was creationism. This is the idea that there is a divine will, a divine being that created many different forms of life as we now see them. Now, there's many types of creationism theories across many different belief systems, but they definitely have these two characteristics that are common between them. First is divine will. Of course, there has to be something, someone, some greater being deciding things. And number two is the immutability of species, which is complicated for unchanging. Whatever was made, it is perfect because it is the divine will, and so it will never change. It will always be the same. So the thing about this is that it doesn't allow for the possibility for change in a species, but at the same time, in a way, it makes it so that each species is more special. If creationism was the actual, was how it actually worked, every time a species went extinct means it's gone. It's never gonna come back. It's just kaput. We just failed the divine being. That's it's something to think about, that if it was creationism, if we only had this set of species in the world, every time we let something go extinct, it means we're letting our divine being down. We're just every time just letting them down. Stewards of the earth, and you're failing. But it's not exactly the theory that is put forth by science, because it's not disprovable, it's not empirical, we can't actually measure it, so we can't actually say if it's true or not. Later theories include the use and disuse theory. This is proposed by John Baptiste Lamarck. So he has a theory of acquired characteristics. It means that the more a species uses something, the more you use something, the more you retain it, and that later generations can have it. And the less you use something, the more you lose it, and later generations will also lose it. So it kind of makes sense in that, for example, if you work out, you get bigger muscles, and if you don't work out, you lose those muscles. But it doesn't get inherited by the next generations. That's the thing that is a bit wrong in his theory, in that some traits are not inherited by the next generation. Some traits are not hereditary. Okay, but he was the first to propose the concept of evolution, in that there is change as generations go on. It changes. So that was a completely radical idea, and we have to give kudos to Baptiste Lamarck, that um, there is change as species go on through the generations. There is a transmutation of species. Okay, it's not immutable. Another guy who also proposed stuff was Georges Cuvier. I can't pronounce his name, it's French or something. So he proposed catastrophism, in that change is not gradual, it happens radically, it happens suddenly, and it happens mostly as catalyzed by catastrophic events. That's why it's catastrophism. So when catastrophes happen, life changes radically. So he supports the immutability of species, in that species don't change unless there is a great radical change in the environment. So he's on the other side of the fence. He's saying, no, no, Baptiste Lamarck, species are mutable. There is a divine being, but when shit happens, when catastrophes happen, it changes everything. So that's for Cuvier. Now, another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, proposed evolution as we know it. He independently thought of evolution through natural selection, the same thing that Charles Darwin thought of independently. It's just that he published it later than Charles Darwin. They got along well. They worked with each other to refine the theory of evolution. So it is an example, a rare example of science being a cooperative work, a cooperative effort of discovery. Normally scientists backstab each other and try to get the credit for themselves, but Wallace is a cool dude. He's a good dude who supported Charles Darwin's work. Now, Charles Darwin, as you might know from the name, is the father of evolution. So he quit med school to pursue becoming a naturalist. He's more interested in researching the natural world than actually, doing medicine. So a clergyman is just someone who's sponsored by the church to study the world around them, which did not go well for them because, he put forth one of the theories that kind of made the church look bad. So Charles Darwin was influenced by scientists who came before him, specifically geologists and economists. So, there is something to be said about the integration or the holistic education of people. So, without the influence of geology and economy, he wouldn't have thought of the theory of evolution. So, there's two geologists, Charles Lyell and James Hutton. These are geologists who write about gradual change. So, if the world can gradually change, why not life? Thomas Malthus, on the other hand, has the Malthusian trap. So you might have encountered that in AP or in your econ classes. So he's an economist that warned of overpopulation. So he talked about the Malthusian trap and that population might exceed the amount of available resources, and that can cause drastic changes and extinction. So these two disciplines, geology and economy, influenced how he thought about biology. So Darwin is also quite a bit of an adventurer. He went worldwide on the HMS Beagle, and he became good friends with another naturalist and the captain of a ship named Captain Robert Fitzroy. So they were good buddies, and they got boners for nature and biology and stuff. So they went around the world and went on pit stops around different islands to observe the local wildlife. Totally not gay. So Darwin again went around the world. So he started in Great Britain and Europe, and then he went around the Cape Horn, went around to the west, and so on. Literally circumnavigated the world. Of course, he also made a very nice pit stop in the Galapagos Islands, as he is famous for. So in the Galapagos Islands, he made a good number of very important and distinct observations. So these islands are found near the equator. They're volcanic islands, and um, since it's an archipelago, since it is on the equator, and since it's volcanic, there's lots of diversity. These are what we now know as selection pressures. There's lots of stuff that makes life hard, and thus necessitates life to adapt to a lot of different things. You have to adapt to the volcanic pressures. You have to adapt to the fact that you're at the equator. You have to adapt to different islands. So there tends to be a lot of biodiversity in these islands. So one of the most famous observations of Charles Darwin is his observations of the finches. So they're called Darwin's finches. These are closely related bird species. They're super closely related. You can barely tell the difference between them. Like if you look at this one on the left and this one on the right, they're almost identical. But what Charles Darwin noticed is that their beaks are extremely different. So their beaks are specialized to what they are accustomed to eating, to their diet. So one is a cactus eater, one eats insects, one eats seeds, and their beaks change morphologically based on their diet, the food that is available to them. Okay? So even though they are very similar morphologically, they are different species, judging at least based on their beak. And later on, there's more evidence that they are completely different species. So the reason why this happens, why there's differences between things that are closely related, is adaptation. So adaptation is when you inherit traits that enhance survival and reproduction in specific environments. This means that over generations, the good traits, traits that help, are retained, and the traits that are bad tend to lead to death. So they aren't retained. So over time, a species adapts to an environment. Okay, and when these adaptations start to accumulate, you tend to form new species. When there's lots and lots of adaptations that make you separate from what you were before. So the fuel for adaptation, the mechanism for it is natural selection, as observed by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Better survival traits and reproductive traits mean that they are inherited by later generations because they're adaptations. They make it easier for that species to live. So again, it's either you survive better or you fuck better. You can make babies better. That means your genes are carried on. So if they're naturally beneficial to survival and reproduction, then they are conserved. Competition is one of the constant forms of selection pressures, something that pressures species into having specific traits. So in an environment, those that are most effective at survival are those that can compete the best, the ones who can get to the food, get to the water, get to the mates. So, there's a competitive aspect in terms of evolution. So that's why it's called survival of the fittest, the most fit to the environment, the most fit to the selection pressures. Now, there's also the term artificial selection. This means that some traits are selected for by something else, like humans. So, one example is selective breeding. If we want chickens that are very cute, then we will breed the chickens that are cute. So the next generations become selectively cuter and cuter. And that's how we got from dinosaurs to chickens. Not really, sort of, part of the way. So again, we have artificial selection. That's the selective type of selection. So the book published by Charles Darwin that changed the world is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So this book described descent with modification. This was the early idea of natural selection. So all species are descended from a common ancestor, but were modified by selection pressures. So from a common ancestor, we had to adapt to different types of environments, adapt to different types of pressures, and so when the descendants had to be modified, the descendants had to evolve, had to adapt, so they became different from each other. There became branching points where different species evolved. So you can see in his notes in his original manuscript, he is not an artist. Guys, if you can do art while understanding science, you have an advantage. This guy did not have that advantage. I can people look, he literally says I think, and you can't even recognize his K. This dude needs lessons. Anyway, so what are some evidences of evolution? How are we so sure that we should accept this theory? So number one, we have anatomy and embryology. There are morphological similarities. You just look at animals, certain animals, and you can see some similarities between them. You know that a tiger is different from a lion, but they have that same body structure that looks like big cat. You know, on the other hand, there's also embryology. If you look at the embryos, the developing embryos of closely related species, they are even more similar than their adult counterparts. Here's an example. So these are the embryos of fish, salamander, tortoise, and chicken and human. So if you look at the embryonic stage of the tortoise, the chicken, and the human, they look very similar. If you go earlier, the earlier you go in the embryonic stages, the more similar they look. So all five of them look similar to each other in the early stages. In the second stage, you start to see differences in the fish and the salamander, but they still look the same to each other. While the tortoise, chicken, and human look similar. And on the final stage, you see that the human is vastly different, but the tortoise and the chicken look similar, and the fish and the salamander look similar. So even in the embryonic stages, we can see some clues as to what are related to each other by which ones become different at different embryonic stages. So we can kind of assume here, it's a bit of an evidence here that fish and salamander are more related to each other than tortoises are to chickens and humans. So, and so on and so forth. Okay. Evidence number two is molecular biology. We just discussed the central dogma. We just saw some Facts about genetics. Now, this is also an evidence for evolution. The similarities in genes and the fact that there's only one information processing system, which is the central dogma of molecular biology, is a clue that all life is related to each other in some way or form. Now, specifically with similarities in genes, one example of that is how in um, fruit flies, in Drosophila, and in mice and in humans, we have ancestral genes that are extremely similar to each other. So these are written in short form. These are genes that are long sequences of DNA already, but the ones that are labeled ancestral gene are very, very similar to each other. They are only different in a few nitrogenous bases each. So, since they're very similar, we can conclude that these are genes that have been passed down and inherited even across species. Okay, so these similarities are there's too many of them. There's three of them here, but there's only a short segment of the DNA. These are there are too many of them to say that they were just coincidences or were inherited in a way except evolution. So we are related in some way to fruit flies. Langaw ka. Evidence number three is homology. So homology is talking about homologous structures. These are body parts that may have different functions but are the same in evolutionary origin. These are things that adapted to a different environment but came from the same common ancestor. On the other hand, we also have analogous structures. These are body parts that have the same purpose but different evolutionary origin. So, how do we differentiate that? We'll see that here. Again, in homologous structures, they're the same evolutionary origin but different purpose. So, you can see in the bat wing, it's for flight. In humans, we use our limbs and our limbs and fingers to grab stuff. But if you look at the bones themselves, the bat's wing is actually a hand. You can see the phalanges, the finger bones stretching throughout the wing. So this is a clue that it's a homologous structure. It is a structure that has the same evolutionary origin, just a different function based on the bone structure. Okay. Analogous structures, on the other hand, even though they have the same function, they have a different evolutionary origin. If you look at the bone structure of the fins of sharks, penguins, and dolphins, they have different bone structures. This is a clue that they're not related to each other, at least in terms of their bone structure. Okay, they just have the same environment, the same selection pressures. Okay, so these homologous and analogous structures give a clue that there are some things that are related to each other, even if they have different environments. And there are some things that have the same environments, but they came from different ancestors. So that's how complicated selection can be. And another thing that we can have, that we can conclude using analogous and homologous structures is the phylogenetic tree. This is just a tree that shows where they branch off, what are their similarities, and where they start to become different. For example, at this branch number one, this branch states that everything before that branch almost exactly the same based on that, except for a certain thing. In this case, digit-bearing limbs. If their limbs have fingers or they have feet that have like digits, they have things that stretch out from the limbs, then they become a different branch from um, the branch that is left behind. So the one that's left behind are lungfishes. Their limbs are actually just like weird primordial fins. On the other hand, everything else here has digits. Okay. And so that's how phylogenetic trees go. You look for something different to segregate the rest of the population with. Okay. And usually those differences are homologous structures. So, what causes analogous structures, the things that are not from the same common ancestor? This is because of convergent evolution. Different ancestors but similar environments mean similar selection pressures. So, they want to fill up what is called an ecological niche. They want to fill up a role, fill up a way of survival. So, if there are similar environments, even if they have different ancestors, they will evolve into the same ecological niche or the same role, so that will cause similarities between them. So this is something that supports natural selection because it shows that selection pressures can dictate what traits will the species have. So even if they have a different ancestor, the selection pressures will determine the traits over time. So evidence number four is the fossil record. We have fossil records that show patterns of evolution over geological time. So if you compare the fossil record of the modern dog to um, mammals in the past, in our fossilized past, they have very similar bone structures and some joints in some structures. And evidence number five is biogeography. So if we remember continental drift theory in our AP class or in our past science classes, some fossils show that there is a distribution of certain species in a geographical context. And then there's other fossils that show that they're endemic and found nowhere else in the world. So in biogeography, this shows that there are certain species that are confined to certain areas. And this shows that there is an evolutionary history in different areas. So, how does it work? How does evolution itself work? What makes it possible? First, there's genetic variation. If there's a change in the genes, there's a change in the traits. So, it occurs when we have, for example, mutations. So mutations are one source of new alleles. So this causes a variation of a gene. So if there's a mutation, if there's a change in the genetic sequence due to mutation, you have a new allele. What about chromosomes? What can happen to chromosomes? So a change in the gene number or position of chromosomes can cause mutations to accumulate. Number three is rapid reproduction. When reproduction occurs very, very quickly, there's many generations, there's more chances for them to adapt or to change in their traits. So, what makes you different from your siblings? There's sexual reproduction. So, in sexual reproduction, this is also a vehicle for evolution because the crossing over of your chromosomes, the independent assortment of chromosomes, and fertilization causes differences between you and your siblings, causes variation between siblings. So those are the four sources. So again, source number one, mutation. Source number two, chromosomal mutation. Source number three, reproduction. And source number four, sex. So these are things that cause genetic variation in your organisms. And that genetic variation can result in evolution. Now, there's also a principle called the Hardy-Weinberg Principle. This is the application of math to evolution. So if we take a look at the gene pool of a certain population and we look at the allele frequency or the ratio of alleles in a population, we can actually see that there's a pattern in ideal populations. So the Hardy-Weinberg principle, if we apply math to a population, we can see if a population is evolving or not. If it's not evolving, the gene pool is said to be at equilibrium. There's a specific um, ratio of everything where it's just not changing at all. So the Hardy-Weinberg equation is p squared plus 2pq plus q squared is equal to 1. If you look at this, this is just the expanded equation for the square of a binomial. P squared plus 2pq plus q squared. It's like p plus q. You take that binomial term equation and you just square it, you get this. Okay? So p is the expected frequency of, for example, the dominant phenotype. Q is the expected frequency of the recessive phenotype. And PQ is the expected frequency of the heterogeneous. Just think of P or Q as a specific allele, and it's basically it. So that's PP or QQ or PQ. Okay. So we expect that the ratios will be equivalent to the ratios if it was equal to 1 in this equation. That would be at equilibrium. It's not evolving. On the other hand, if it is evolving, it will not follow this equation. So again, it's an example of math in evolution. So we won't tackle that too much. We're just going to tackle the concept of it. So the Hardy-Weinberg principle, the necessary conditions in order to apply this principle is that number one, there should be no mutations. Number two, there should be random mating. Number three, there's no natural selection pressure involved. And number four, it's a very large population to avoid statistical anomalies. So these are the conditions to apply the Hardy-Weinberg principle. Okay, so if you look at the conditions, this is very similar to the sources of genetic variation. What we're trying um, to avoid is the influence of the genetic variation or selection pressures, to be able to conclude that the population is evolving on its own. Okay, so what can alter allele frequencies, the mechanisms for evolution? Of course, we discussed natural selection. Um, there's also genetic drift. These are random changes in allele frequencies. This is what's being tested for in the Hardy-Weinberg principle, how genetic changes can stack up over time. So that's called genetic drift. So one form of genetic drift is the founder effect. It's a form of genetic drift that happens suddenly. So when a group is isolated from the population, it means that when they found a new population, it has its own gene pool, and that gene pool can vary extremely differently from the original population. Okay, and can eventually cause what we call speciation, or the formation of a new species. When one population can no longer mate with another, that's considered a different species. Okay? Another form of genetic drift is the bottleneck effect. When most of the population dies, it forms a bottleneck, causing only a few organisms to form the new gene pool. So the surviving population will have a very different gene pool from the original population. Okay? Gene flow is another way that the allele frequencies can change. It's the mating between different populations. So genes can flow between gene pools. So when different populations mate with each other, it mixes their gene pools. Okay. Now another thing to consider in evolution is selection. So based on sex. So there's sexual selection, just like how some simps don't get selected for Intrasexual competition means the same sex competes for the opposite sex, while intersexual selection means the opposite sex is choosy. So they choose their mates. Okay. So intrasexual is like when, the peacock type thing where no, not peacocks. When males compete for the female, so they fight each other and stuff. Intersexual selection, on the other hand, is when the males have to impress the females, for example. Okay. So this is another selection pressure that defines evolution. This is how you get male peacocks with extremely extravagant tails, because they have to compete sexually for to be able to mate. Okay, so where do new species come from? They come from speciation, and speciation is determined by uh, the selection pressures and isolation. So again, when you isolate a population, that usually makes it so that it either dies off or becomes a new species over many generations. So one type of isolation is reproductive isolation. Basically, there's no gene flow between populations. They don't want to fuck with each other. That's it. That's basically it. One type of reproductive isolation is due to habitat isolation. It's because they live in very different places. Just like now in COVID quarantine. If your if your friend lives in a different area, you can't mate unless you travel, which is exposing yourself and your friend. So don't remain isolated. Temporal isolation, on the other hand, they are active at different times. So one is active at night, one is active in the morning. They're never gonna see each other. Behavioral isolation is basically they don't like each other's behaviors. So hindi nila type yung isa't isa. Okay? Mechanical isolation is literally the morphological differences prevent successful mating. Like if the pee too small, literally the sperm can't reach the egg. Okay? So the actual physical differences. Gametic isolation is the isolation where the sperm cannot fertilize the egg. In literally the gametes are not compatible with each other. This is the main reason why different species can't mate. Like your cat can't fertilize a dog because of gametic isolation and morphological isolation. So, what are the models of speciation? How do species come up? We have allopatric speciation. This is because they're geographically isolated. And we have sympatric speciation, which is they're in the same place, but they're not mating. So, that's pretty much it. Okay. That's a lot of information to consider, I know, but we're going to stop the recording here.